at AIMS New Delhi, and today I'm going to share a small presentation of how we would examine a bony lesion. I'm not sure how much it is relevant to your exam, but I believe at least for the surgical oncologist, this presentation might be a little bit helpful of how you should present a extremity swelling. And I've made a short video as well. If you have any doubts, you can interrupt me anytime. Okay. So why is this important to you? Because this is what normally you discuss in your day-to-day practice, because sarcomas or bony swellings do not often be discussed as a main case in your practice. But sometimes in the exam you get these cases because that's what was available to on the day. And for the orthopedic part, a candidate is expected to know the examination of a swelling. He is expected to arrive at a rational differential diagnosis and discuss the management protocols and recent evidence. So what are the chief complaints of a bone tumor? Most bone tumors, especially benign ones, present as a swelling noted incidentally or following trivial trauma. The pain is usually aching in character in bone tumors, and pain followed by swelling is usually suggestive of osteosarcoma. So osteosarcoma alone, patients will have pain followed by swelling. In majority of the other bone tumors, usually it's the swelling which is first noticed, followed by pain. And the pain mainly occurring during the night and typically relieved by NSAIDs is a typical history of osteoid osteoma, which sometimes the examiner would like you to know or mention. What is more important about bone tumors is they do not often present only as a swelling. They have multiple other problems. Say, for example, they can have a deformity, they can have a limb length discrepancy, or they can have associated soft tissue problems like this particular tumor presented as a bursitis. You can see in all of the four cases, the presenting swelling is an osteochondroma, but the presentation is different, or the complaint of the patient is different. So you are expected to know all these different things and examine and look for these different features in your presentation. If you happen to have a case like this, it's usually kept as a short case for your exam. So what is the examiner will ask you? He will first ask you the 4 classical questions of a short case. What is your diagnosis will be the first question. So you are supposed to say, my diagnosis is a benign tumor of right proximal tibia with or without neurological deficit, or a malignant tumor of right distal femur, possibly an osteosarcoma. My second differential will be an Ewing sarcoma with pulmonary metastasis. So you have to be complete in your diagnosis. You need to be able to discuss what are the points in favor of and against your diagnosis. You must be able to give differential diagnosis based upon the points which are against your diagnosis, and you must be able to tell us how will you manage your patient. Always start with investigations before jumping to treatment, and always start with non-invasive investigations first before jumping to invasive investigations like biopsy, and do not forget the staging workup. So how do you differentiate between a benign tumor and malignant tumor? It's all the thing which is expected out of a clinical examination. So a benign tumor will usually lie within the compartment, whereas a malignant tumor will extend more beyond one compartment. Benign tumor will have a slow growth, whereas malignant tumor will have a rapid growth. Of course, swelling will be first noticed in benign tumors, whereas pain will be the presenting feature in malignant tumors. And benign ones the start spread, whereas metastasis can be a presenting feature in malignant tumors. So with this introduction, I would just give a quick video of how I would examine a bony swelling. Then we will discuss the rest of it. On inspection from the front, the patient is lying comfortably supine with his hip in extension, knee in extension, and the ankle in neutral position. There is mild wasting of the quadriceps on the left side compared to the right side. The most obvious swelling is present on the proximal two-thirds of the left leg. There are mild occult scars present over the anterior aspect of the knee, 3 in number, and there is a skin excoriation on the medial aspect of the left leg. There is presence of multiple dilated veins over the anterior aspect of the leg. There is a diffuse globular swelling present over the proximal two-thirds of the left leg, predominantly over the lateral aspect. There are no other obvious scars on inspection from the front. There are no pulsations or sinuses present from the inspection on the anterior aspect. On inspection from the lateral aspect, there is no obvious fixed flexion deformity of the knee. There is a diffuse globular swelling present over the proximal two-thirds of the leg. There is a biopsy scar of congenital biopsy situated on the distal aspect of the swelling at the junction of proximal and middle third of the leg. There are no dilated veins on the lateral aspect of the leg. On inspection from the posterior aspect of the leg, there is no obvious wasting of the hamstring muscles, and there are no obvious pulsations seen over the popliteal area. The most obvious finding is the presence of a swelling over the lateral aspect of the left leg over the proximal two-third. There is a excoriation present over the lateral aspect of the swelling and also over the middle of the popliteal area. There are no dilated veins. There are no sinuses. Before palpation, it's important that you need to wash your hands with soap and water or with a sterilium solution, which is available to ensure proper disinfection. So let the sterilium dry, and then first thing I would like to do is palpation, is to look for temperature. On palpation, the temperature over the swelling is raised. I am looking at the face of the patient. There is tenderness on the palpation, and the skin over the swelling is fixable and it is not fixed. The swelling is globular in shape, present over the lateral aspect of the proximal two-thirds of the leg, and it is continuous with the fibula. On palpation of the shin of the tibia, I am able to feel that there is a depression between the swelling and the tibia, and the swelling is distinct from the tibial border. The surface of the swelling is smooth. The consistency is firm to hard in different places, and the swelling extends deep into the posterior aspect of the leg. I am looking for pulsations of the popliteal vessels. The pulsation is palpable. Now, I would like to compare the pulsation with the opposite leg, and it's almost equal. I'm going to measure the size of the swelling. For clinical purposes, I have marked the margins of the swelling, but I would like to tell that the margins are imperceptible in this case, and it's not very well defined. So the way I will present in the exam, the swelling is approximately 14 centimeter in length and 14 centimeter in breadth, and the margins are imperceptible. I'm looking for tenderness in the knee joint, and there is no joint-like tenderness, both medially as well as laterally, and there is no tenderness in the patellofemoral joint as well. On both the knees, there does not appear to be any fixed flexion deformity, and the knees are in full extension. By Brady-Gupta-Mollo, on the right side, the range of motion is the active range of motion is pain-free, and the knee is flexed up to 130 degrees. See that umbrella? On the left side, again, the range of motion is pain-free, but there is around 20 degrees of flexion restriction on the left side compared to the right side. Further, passive flexion is mechanically restricted, and that does not appear to be any pain for the patient. On measurements, we have to measure longitudinal measurements as well as circumferential measurements. First, we will go for longitudinal measurement. Since the area of interest is the leg, I am just demonstrating how to measure the limb length discrepancy involving the leg compartment alone. So, for the leg, I have marked the tip of the medial malleolus here and the medial joint line here, and the same points have been mapped to the opposite side. And for the measurements, I can see that it's around 38 centimeter on medial side, on the right side as well as on the left side. So there is no limb length discrepancy involving the compartment of interest. The second thing we would like to do is circumferential measurements. The problem of doing circumferential measurement in the leg compartment is that the swelling will make the measurements erroneous. So I would like to demonstrate it only in the thigh compartment. Mark the point around 15 centimeter proximal to the medial joint line on both the legs. On measurement of the circumference, it's approximately 39 centimeter on the left side compared to 41 centimeter on the right side. Okay, now we will examine the distal neurovascular status of the patient. For the neural status, we will have to do sensory examination as well as the motor examination. Sensory examination, we need to look for sensory distribution in the greater saphenous nerve, superficial and deeper nerve, as well as in the pseudonerve area. For the motor function, we need to look for functions of the common peroneal nerve, and then we will look for pulsations. First of all, I would like to explain the sensations. भैया मैं दोनों तरफ चुन रहा हूँ, दोनों तरफ आपको बराबर समझ में आ रहा है? यहाँ बराबर समझ में आ रहा है, यहाँ बराबर समझ में आ रहा है, यहाँ बराबर समझ में आ रहा है. The sensations are equal and comparable on both sides. Now I would like to do the motor examination. For the common peroneal nerve, I would like to look for tibialis anterior function, which is supplied by the common peroneal. So we would like to do active dorsiflexion against resistance. मैं पैर को ऊपर की तरफ खींचना और नीचे मुझे धक्का देने मत देना, ठीक है? दोनों तरफ ऊपर की तरफ खींचो. And then I'm trying to look for power of the tibialis anterior. The left side is slightly weak compared to the right side, but still I will rate the power as 4 plus on the left side compared to 5/5 on the right side. Next, I would like to look for pulsations. Pulsations of the dorsalis penis is felt over the navicular and over the cuneiform bones, just medial to the extensor hallucis longus, just lateral to the extensor hallucis longus tendon. And then I am looking for pulsations for the posterior tibial artery. Both the pulsations are equal. I am looking for lymphadenopathy both in the popliteal area as well as in the inguinal region. And there are no obvious lymph nodes palpable. I need to compare it with the opposite side as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
So, any questions with the examination of a bony swelling before I move on to discuss the X-ray and relevant discussion? No. Okay. So let me move on. So first thing which the examiner asks you will, how will you differentiate a benign and a malignant bone tumor? So how will you differentiate it? Its differentiation is not based upon a single history or examination finding. So generally, how I teach my postgraduates, I ask them to remember 5 points in history, 3 points in general examination, 5 points in inspection, 5 points in palpation, and 2 other points. That's how I ask them to remember in a form of a mnemonic. So in the history, we would like to look for these features. How did the symptoms start? Was it the swelling followed by pain or pain followed by swelling? What was the duration? Whether the patient is able to use the body part with or without difficulty, and whether he has got any symptoms of metastasis. Is there any history of chemotherapy? Out of all this, History of chemotherapy is the most single pathognomonic finding in favor of a malignant swelling. So what do I mean by that? When I say that malignant tumors like osteosarcoma usually have pain followed by swelling, but there can be some patients where osteosarcoma will be first noticed as a swelling. So that finding is not pathognomonic of osteosarcoma, whereas history of chemotherapy is the only history which is pathognomonic of a malignant swelling. Next thing, on general examination, we need to look for three things: findings of cachexia like ill-built, poorly nourished, pale, or loss of hair; findings suggestive of metastasis such as pleural effusion; or swelling in multiple sides of the body or deformed forearm. Why deformed forearm? A condition called osteochondroma can have multiple hereditary exhaustosis, and one of those exhaustosis can convert into a chondrosarcoma. So supposing you have a case of chondrosarcoma, and if you didn't look at the forearm, then it's a big blunder, because that will be the clinching point to differentiate between a familial and a sporadic chondrosarcoma. And similarly, we have certain points in inspection: skin being stretched and shiny, dilated veins, irregular surface, wasting of the limb, and ulceration or fungation. So all of these features are in favor of a malignant swelling because they demonstrate the rapidity of growth of the swelling. On palpation, we need to look for raised temperature, significant tenderness, ill-defined margins, variable consistency, and fixity to underlying structures or to the skin. So these features suggest that the swelling is rapidly progressive, and it also crosses the planes, or it moves from one compartment to other. So then it is more in favor of a malignant swelling. And finally, two other points: joint mobility may be restricted, and there may be presence of distal neurovascular deficit, or very, very rarely, you can have proximal lymph node metastasis from a sarcoma. But of course, only certain soft tissue sarcomas are known to do that, and it's not very common with a bone sarcoma. So other question which the examiner will like you to know from clinical examination is, how would you differentiate a soft tissue malignancy secondarily involving the bone from a bony malignancy with the associated soft tissue component? See, in both the cases, the swelling will be immobile and attached to the underlying bone. However, in a primary bony malignancy, the swelling will be continuous with the bone when palpating along the edges of the swelling. Whereas in a primary soft tissue malignancy, you will be able to feel a depression or a dip between the bony contour and the swelling. And a primary soft tissue tumor will be present in only one compartment, whereas primary bone tumor with soft tissue component, the soft tissue component will be present in more than one compartment. What do I mean by that? Supposing you have a distal femur osteosarcoma, the soft tissue component may be present both anteriorly as well as posteriorly. Whereas if you have a soft tissue sarcoma in the quadriceps adhering to the distal femur, the swelling will be entirely present in the anterior compartment, whereas the posterior or flexor compartment will be completely normal. So these are the two features. And there are certain radiological features by which you can differentiate a soft tissue tumor from a primary bony tumor. So one is, if you mark the epicenter of the tumor on the X-ray, if the epicenter lies within the bone, it is mostly a bony tumor. Whereas if it lies outside the bone, it's high probability that it's a soft tissue tumor. Second thing is, you look at the bevel of the cortex. For a bone tumor with a soft tissue component, the tip of the bevel will be directed outside. Whereas if the soft tissue tumor is invading the bone the tip of the bevel will be pointing inside or towards the middle of the bone. Periosteal reaction will be typically absent in a soft tissue tumor involving the bone, and most soft tissue tumors involving the bone will have a large soft tissue mass and a small bone lesion. So, having said that, for this, for today's teaching, this lesion is a proximal fibula GCT, I'll just bring the X-rays for you. Can you see the X-rays, please? No?
No, no, sir.
Okay. I'll stop sharing my PPT and I will share the X-ray screen for now.
Okay, sir.
Can you see it now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yeah. Does anyone want to volunteer to read the X-ray? Then I would just demonstrate. Can you just see? There are only 14 participants. You can be very informal. Just say, tell me how will you read this X-ray?
This is a X-ray of the leg distal AP and lateral view showing the knee joint, and there is a lytic lesion involving the proximal end of the fibula.
I'm sorry, you're not audible now.
Sir, this is a AP and a lateral view of the leg showing the knee joint, and there is a lytic lesion involving the proximal end of the fibula.
So you are right, but let me just qualify a bit more and then explain how I would read this X-ray. So this is a plain radiograph. First of all, you need to say whether it's a plain or a contrast radiograph. This is a plain radiograph, AP and lateral view of left leg of a skeletally mature patient. So if the patient is a child, you will see the physeal plate or the physeal scar. You cannot see the physeal plate or physeal scar here. So this is so the patient is a skeletally mature patient. So this is a skeletally mature patient, Mr. Adesh Singh, who is an 18-year-old male, showing a lesion in the left proximal fibula in its proximal 1/3, and there is a lytic lesion situated on the lateral condyle of proximal tibia. So the lesion is geographic in the lesion is geographic, and it has multiple internal trabeculations with narrow margins and narrow zone of transition. I cannot see any obvious soft tissue component shadows in this X-ray. Clinico-radiologically, this lesion is a epiphyseal lesion. Hence, I would think of a giant cell tumor. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yeah. So now I would like go back to the presentation.
Sure, sir.
So the next thing the examiner will ask you is, how will you grade the lesion? So there is a separate grading for giant cell tumors of the bone. This grading was given by Mario Campanacchi from Italy, Bologna. So grade 1 is well-defined margins with a mature rim of mature bone. The cortex is either intact or slightly thinned, but it is not deformed. Whereas in grade 2, the radiopaque rim will be absent. The cortex is thinned and moderately expanded. In grade 3, we will have indistinct borders and the tumor bulges into the soft tissues, and the soft tissue mass did not follow the contour of the bone. So there is no limitation by shell of bone. So this particular lesion will be grade 2 because we had a rim, but we did not, the cortex is thinned and expanded, but we did not have any soft tissue mass. So how would you stage the lesion? The staging and grading are different for giant cell tumors. The staging is according to Enicki. We stage the lesion as either latent, active, or aggressive. For your exam, the lesions which are kept in your exam will be either active or aggressive, because latent lesions are usually asymptomatic, incidentally discovered, so they won't be kept for your exam. So you must see whether the lesion has broken the cortex, means whether it is Campanaki grade 2 or 3. Mostly Campanaki grade 3 lesions are aggressive, whereas grade 2 lesions are active. So what is a germ cell tumor? That will be the next question. So the germ cell tumor is a neoplasm of mesenchymal stromal cells that have the ability to recruit and harbor macrophages and osteoclast type germ cells. So basically, the term germ cell tumor is a misnomer. The germ cells are not the neoplastic cells. In fact, the mesenchymal stromal cells, which are spindle cells, are the neoplastic cells, where the germ cells are actually reactive macrophages. The macrophages coalesce to form germ cells. However, Bloodgood, when he first looked at these tumors, he thought the germ cells are the neoplastic cells, and hence he coined the term GCT. It is otherwise known as osteoclastoma. So what is the pathogenesis? Almost any kind of tumor in the bone can contain germ cells. However, the term GCT should be reserved to those tumors which have a combination of mononuclear stromal cells and more or less uniformly distributed germ cells. The nuclei of germ cells in GCT should be very similar to the stromal cells. That is very important. If you have a germ cell variant, the nuclei of the germ cells will not look similar to the stromal cells. The nuclei will have different morphological features. And atypical mitosis are usually not seen. If you see atypical mitosis in GCT, highly likely that you can have a germ cell rich osteosarcoma or telangiectatic osteosarcoma. So the neoplastic stromal cells, they have multiple factors, including the rank ligand, tumor necrosis factor, monocyte colony stimulating factor, and vascular endothelial growth factor. The germ cells have the rank. So this interaction between rank ligand and rank leads to activation of the macrophages, and they coalesce to form germ cells. As you can see here, the rank ligand is expressed in stromal cells, whereas the rank is expressed in macrophage mononuclear cells derived from white cell lineage, which on interaction coalesce to form germ cells, and they undergo and they cause osteolysis of the bone. So the next important question is, how would you investigate the patient? For investigation, you need to look for local workup and systemic workup. Germ cell tumors usually metastasis only to the chest, so there is no need to go for PET scan. However, it is important that you need to do a local MRI. The need for MRI is to look at the size of the tumor, extent of the tumor, vascularity, neurovascular encasement of the tumor, and secondarily, we also look for joint involvement. Please understand that despite the tumors being epiphyseal in location, majority of the germ cell tumors do not enter into the joint because the articular cartilage is a significant tumor. It's a significant structure which will prevent tumor spread into the joint. So how will you treat this lesion? So curettage is the typical treatment because majority of the germ cell tumors are usually detected when they are in the active stage where you have a cortical rim. Curettage, however, if it is oncologically adequate and having good functional outcome, it is associated with high rates of recurrence because it is a R2 resection. You go inside the tumor and curate it. So there is a high chance that you leave behind gross tumor cells which will come back as recurrence. Whereas wide excision, you can achieve R0 margins. It can be oncologically adequate, but because majority of these tumors are located in the epiphysis, the patients will have significant disability due to the loss of functioning joint. Hence, we normally go for extended curettage, which is a kind of bargain between curettage and wide excision, where we extend the margins with the help of adjuvants. See, this is a patient who has got an extended curettage and bone grafting, and he has got excellent function. It's got GCT of a proximal tibia. So how will you perform curettage? This question will be sometimes asked in for surgical oncology exams. It's not so important for medical oncologists or radiation oncologists. So basically you need to create a large cortical window which should be of adequate size, more or less the size of the tumor. Otherwise, you will leave behind tumors behind the cortical shell. The window should be elliptical in shape. It should be along the long axis of the bone. You should remove the soft tissues, break all septa, and you must use a mechanical burr, because mechanical burr is the only adjuvant which is proven to reduce recurrence rate. We can also use headlamps or dental mirrors or pulsatile lavage systems. So if they ask you regarding adjuvants, first of all, you need to classify the adjuvants. You need to classify them as mechanical, physical, or chemical. So mechanical is high speed burr. Chemical adjuvants can be either phenol or carbolic acid or hydrogen peroxide or liquid nitrogen. Phenol, it is used in a percentage varying from 5 to 80%, and it causes thermal necrosis of the cells. The disadvantage of phenol is it cannot differentiate between a normal and abnormal tissue, and there is high systemic absorption, especially if the phenol is applied to a soft tissue. Systemic absorption is less within the bone. Hence, it is always important that the phenol should be applied only within the cavity, and we should avoid spillage because it can cause skin burns also. And the time required is at least 6 minutes. Liquid nitrogen, it can destroy the cells by freezing them. You need at least 3 freeze-thaw cycles. The advantages are low recurrence rate and excellent function. But again, the disadvantage is it can cause pathological fractures by significantly weakening the bone, and it can lead to articular cartilage damage, especially because these lesions are epiphyseal in location. Hence, liquid nitrogen is not very popular. We can use organ beam coagulation, which causes thermal coagulation of the cells. The recurrence rates are less. However, long-term follow-up studies are still awaited. We can do carbonization with electrocautery, but we cannot use the normal cautery which you'll use for your routine surgical procedures. You need to have ball-tipped cautery, which are special cauteries. How will you reconstruct a defect after extended curettage? You can either use bone graft or bone cement. For smaller defects, it can be left alone, but majority of the times, if you get a case in the exam, it is usually a large defect. So you need to use one of the substitutes, either autograft, allograft, or bone cement or bone substitutes. I normally prefer bone cement because the methyl methacrylate monomer in the bone cement it's cytotoxic to cells, so it can cause tumor kill, and there is heat generated from the cement will help you in extending the margins. There is no donor site morbidity, there is no risk of disease transmission, and it's very cheap. However, the main drawback of cement it is not a biological material. Sometimes if you use it for neck femur fracture, it can cause pathological fractures. The advantage of bone graft is it is a biological material, undergoes remodeling. However, it is associated with donor site morbidity. Autograft is limited in quantity. Allograft is not always available because bone banks are very few in the country. So what will be a follow-up protocol? The follow-up is similar to any osteosarcoma. 3 months for the first 2 years, 6 months up to 5 years, and then yearly after until even 15 years. What will you look for in the follow-up radiographs? You will look for local recurrence. Local recurrences are usually related to margins. Means if our curettage is inadequate, there is high chance with the tumor will recur locally. It will be clinically characterized by pain and radiologically by progressive lysis of the bone graft or cancellous bone. It is very easy to detect recurrence in the presence of bone cement. That is an added advantage of using a bone cement. And there are studies which say that you can also use serum tartrate resistant acid phosphatase as a tumor marker to detect recurrence. However, the utility is questionable because it is not always raised in each and every recurrent tumor. The principle of management of local recurrence in GCT is exactly the same as treating a primary tumor. So if you have a soft tissue recurrence, you can just go ahead and do a wide excision. But if you have a bony recurrence, you can go ahead and do a curettage. Supposing the recurrence is so big that curettage is not possible, then you can go ahead and do a wide excision with reconstruction. So what are the role of pharmacological agents? So first of all, we must understand none of the pharmacological agents, either denosumab or zoledronic acid, is acceptable worldwide. So you must say in the exam that these pharmacological agents are still used in research or selected clinical settings, and there is no universal protocol for management of these pharmacological agents. You all will know about denosumab, so I'm not going too much into denosumab. It's a humanized monoclonal antibody against rank ligand. It specifically binds and blocks rank ligand, resulting in inhibition of osteoclastic activity, decrease in bone resorption, and potential increase in bone mineral density. And these are one of the earliest studies which say that denosumab induces bone formation and reduces or eliminates rank positive tumor germ cells. However, the main problem with denosumab is the neoplastic stromal cells can still be persistent after denosumab therapy. We in our institute use bisphosphonates, especially because the bisphosphonates are very cheap, and we use zoledronic acid preferably even as a neoadjuvant setting. The advantages of bisphosphonates is they are they cause apoptosis of the tumor cells. So they are actually tumoricidal, whereas denosumab is only tumoristatic. And also they inhibit osteoclastic activity. We have had excellent experience in using this zoledronic acid, and we have even published our research work where we have studied the electron microscopy after administration of zoledronic acid therapy, where we have had significant apoptosis of 41.5% in the bisphosphonate group compared to 6% of apoptosis in the control group. This is one such case. This is a recurrent giant cell tumor. You can see as we gave further zoledronic acid therapy, the tumor had completely consolidated, which has assisted our treatment of this particular recurrent tumor. We went ahead and did a resection. So what are the recent advancements in pathogenesis of giant cell tumors? We have recently understood that majority of these giant cell tumors are associated with histone protein mutations, especially H3F3A. And the other counterpart of giant cell tumor, which is a chondroblastoma, has got H3F3B mutations. So both these tumors, interestingly, are epiphyseal tumors. However, histopathologically, both these tumors are very, very distinct. Chondroblastoma will have cartilage areas, whereas giant cell tumors will have stromal cells and germ cells. But interestingly, the molecular pathogenesis seems to be very close in these tumors with histone protein mutations. In giant cell tumor, there is mutation of protein at the 34th location, where the glycine is replaced with tryptophan, whereas for the chondroblastomas at the 36th location, there is replacement of lysine with methionine. So this H3.3 G34W mutation and its other variants G34R and G34B has been used in IHC these days. We have got IHC antibodies specific for these mutations, and there are even reports which say that primary GCTs should harbor these H3.3 mutations, whereas if these mutations are absent, they are not actually primary GCTs. In fact, secondary giant cell rich lesions, either due to chondroblast, other tumors such as Brown's tumor or fibrous dysplasia or even malignant GCT. And there are studies which interestingly correlate these mutations with therapy as well. As you can see, they have found that when the denosumab is used for treatment, the stromal cells start producing immature new bone. So within the tumor bone formation, there is uptake of H3.3 G34W antibodies, as is shown here. I'll just go through this histopathological slide. This first slide is the primary GCT. As you can see, they have taken up the antibody. The second slide, the primary GCT without denosumab treatment. You can see that within the bone forming areas, there is minimal uptake of these antibodies. Whereas the third slide, after denosumab treatment, you can see extensive sclerosis or bone formation, and there is extensive uptake of these antibodies. What does it mean? When you treat a patient with denosumab, the stromal cells in fact become osteogenic and they produce immature new bone. So that is why if you give denosumab and do an intralesional curettage, there is high chance that these stromal cells will reactivate later, leading to recurrence. That is why if you are going to give denosumab to a patient preoperatively, we should try and go for wide excision and we should not go for curettage, as there has been many reports that denosumab treatment is associated with high recurrence after curettage. So final few questions. Can a GCT metastasize? Metastasis in GCT is possible. It is histologically identical to primary lesion. The most common site is the lung. The interval between onset of tumor and detection of lung metastasis is about 4 to 5 years. The natural history of metastatic lesion is unpredictable and complete excision of metastasis is successful. Metastatic lesion, wherever possible, should be resected. However, if they are not amenable to resection, we can go for radiotherapy or chemotherapy with limited success. Steroids have got a role in management of these metastases. Why is GCT still considered benign when it is locally aggressive and has ability to metastasize? This is because metastatic disease in GCT does not carry the same poor prognosis as malignant tumors. Both metastatic and non-metastatic tumors look similar on histology, and considering GCT as malignant will result in all patients undergoing wide excision, which will lead to unacceptable morbidity. So is there a separate entity called malignant GCT? Yes. Two types of malignant GCTs are there. Primary malignant GCTs are extremely rare, where you have GCT-like areas along with high-grade sarcomas. The radiological features are sometimes difficult to differentiate from a benign GCT. However, there are recent reports that these are actually germ cell-rich sarcomas. Secondary malignant GCTs usually happen after radiation treatment. About 20 years ago, radiotherapy used to be one of the primary modalities of treatment of GCTs, and some of these irradiated GCTs can have malignant sarcomas developing at the treated site. The sarcoma is usually a high-grade osteosarcoma or fibrosarcoma, and they carry a very poor prognosis. So this is a final treatment algorithm. When you have a germ cell tumor, if it is in an expandable location like upper end of fibula or lower end of ulna, just go ahead and excise without any reconstruction. However, if it is not in an expandable location, then we will have to look whether curettage is feasible or not. Normally, if you have cortical rim in at least 3 margins of the bone, then we can go ahead and do a curettage. Supposing if the cortex is deficient in more than two sides, then it is not possible to do a curettage. If it is possible to do a curettage, go for extended curettage with reconstruction with bone cement or graft. If it is not possible to do a curettage, go for excision with reconstruction with either prosthesis or bone graft, which can be autograft, allograft, or vascularized fibula grafting. I'd also like to take this opportunity to tell you that there is a fellowship program going on in musculoskeletal oncology at AIIMS Delhi. We have a twice-year entry. And if some of you may be interested, you can apply, especially for orthopedic surgeons. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was indeed a wonderful class and very
Any
nicely
questions?
explained the concept of GCT. Sir, one question I have that as you said that the malignant GCT could be alongside sarcomas. So how would we diagnose that? Because if we take a chunk of biopsy, so will it be a heterogeneous like alongside sarcoma? So uh, it will depend upon what chunk of tissue we take. So is it like that? Means how
Yes.
will we diagnose malignant GCT? Because that's what.
Okay. That's a good question. So majority of the times, primary malignant GCTs are usually reported in the final histopathological report, and they are easily missed in the biopsy. So what I learned is we do not usually do tumor board before biopsies, but when you get a chance to discuss with the radiologist, you will see that in a primary malignant GCT, the sarcomatous areas will show different signal intensities on the MRI compared to normal GCTs. So if you have a heterogeneous tumor on MRI with a good solid soft tissue component, which is showing different signals compared to the giant cell tumor with secondary ABC like areas, then those areas has to be specifically targeted while doing a biopsy, preferably using a CT guidance or using an ultrasound guidance. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And sir, one study which you mentioned, which you did in your department about role of IV zoledronic acid in management of GCT,
Yeah.
there was a prospective randomized clinical, radiological, and electron microscopic analysis. So, like, what did you see under the electron microscope? Like, what was
Yeah.
that study about?
So basically, there is something called apoptosis index in electron microscopy. Uh, Let me see if I can bring back those slides. Yeah. So you need to look for nucleus changes and cytoplasmic changes. In nucleus, you are looking for pycnosis, clumping of chromatin, nuclear fragmentation, and blebs in the nuclear membrane. In cytoplasm, you are looking for dense mitochondria, disorganized endoplasmic reticulum, and cell junction break. Okay. So you can see that this is not, it is not a summation of these. Based upon all these features, you get a mean apoptotic index. As you can see, the apoptotic index is very high in the bisphosphonate group compared to the
So
control
your
group.
screen is not visible.
Let me try. Why is it? Probably I get stopped sheen screen, that's why. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. So we need to look for nuclear changes as well as cytoplasmic changes. The nuclear changes of apoptosis like pycnosis, clumping of chromatin, nuclear fragmentation and blebs, cytoplasmic changes, dense mitochondria, disorganized endoplasmic reticulum, and cell junction break. So you can see that we had 15 patients in the bisphosphonate and control group. The apoptotic index is not a summation of this, but there's a formula which is mentioned in the manuscript. You can see the apoptotic index is high in the bisphosphonate group compared to the control group. And also the bisphosphonates were given over a period of 3 months. You can see that the tumor volume remained almost the same. Means once we started the bisphosphonates, the tumor stopped growing. It did not continue to grow. So that itself means that the bisphosphonate is working on the tumor to prevent it from further progression.
So, sir, when did you means you took again a biopsy after giving bisphosphonate? So, like
We operated on this
to
patient.
examine this.
We operated on these patients.
Okay, so
So this is a
okay,
bisphosphonate given as a neoadjuvant setting. So patient comes to you, you do a biopsy. The biopsy comes as giant cell tumor. You start the patient on zoledronic acid, 3 doses, 4 milligram, 1 monthly intervals. Okay.
Yes.
After 3 doses,
And yes,
you operate upon this patient.
yes, sir. And sir, can you please say something about how to differentiate between parosteal and periosteal? These terms are a bit confusing and
So you want to know how to differentiate between a parosteal and periosteal osteosarcoma.
yes, sir. Means these terms keep on coming again and again, but it's a bit confusing.
I'll just give it. I'm stopping my sharing. I think it's better to stop recording if you're recording.